The focus for the past couple of weeks has been on breathing a little more life into the environment for my Australian Swagman themed bushcraft survival game. This has included adding some plants with proper depth sorting, variations, and realistic placement using simplex noise. I've set up an automated and efficient way to do collision checks that look realistic but also don't require me manually setting up hitboxes. I've also added an actual player sprite now, and it seems that every time I do one of these devlogs, the fire mechanic just keeps getting more and more unhinged. We'll take a proper look at that later and do the traditional create an absurdly large fire and see if we can maintain 60 FPS test. But let's first walk through how I got up to this point over the last couple of weeks. So this is where we left off in the last devlog, and the first thing I worked on was just adding this gum tree to the game. I wasn't initially sure how I'd approach programming the environment, but just to see it in the game quickly, I just added it as another type of fuel so it would spawn just like the sticks and logs. Since I'd set the other objects up to only appear when the player was nearby, this had the fun side effect of having the trees fade in and out, which was kind of trippy but not quite what I wanted. I could also move the entire tree just like any other fuel source, which isn't ideal either. But I did actually want to keep this gum tree as a fuel object. As I mentioned before, fire will be a core part of the game along with the dangers it brings, and gum trees are basically giant wooden containers of flammable eucalyptus oil. This is a big part of why Australia has such devastating bushfires, but surprisingly being so flammable is also a part of how the gum tree is able to thrive so well in Australia. So what I ended up doing was setting up a system that would allow me to provide extra configurations for objects. This way I can easily configure whether something should be combustible or movable. So in this case I could set the gum tree to be combustible but not movable. But there are also other configurations I've added, like whether an item should be collidable, how frequently it should appear, whether it should always be visible, and more. To deal with only being able to see the gum tree up close, I split the items I'm rendering into two groups. Visible items, as in those that are currently visible due to the proximity of the player, and always visible items, which will be visible regardless of how close the player is. The items in the always visible group won't have the fade in and remove effects applied. But then there is also the question of how to place these trees and other plants. I don't want everything just randomly scattered around because it wouldn't look very natural. What I ended up with is this, which is procedural, so it will be different every time, and most importantly, I don't need to manually place all of this myself. One thing I find interesting about walking through the bush is that you generally can't just walk in any direction you want. You are kind of forced, or at least coerced, into walking along trails which create a sort of river-like flow through the landscape. I wanted to replicate this feeling in the game, and so I used a technique that is often used for terrain generation, a noise map. We can randomly generate noise in various forms, but what I used is a simplex noise generator, which as a visual representation might look something like this. We can then imagine that noise overlaid onto the game map. Now if we sample this noise at any point, we will be given a number ranging from -1 to 1. The points that are completely white would have a value of 1, and the points that are completely black would have a value of -1. And then we have everything between those values. If we wanted to create mountains, for example, we could have the peaks be where the value is 1 and the valleys be where the value is -1. In my case, I used the high values to be where I would most likely spawn larger trees, the middle values where I would spawn smaller shrubs, and the low values where I would spawn nothing so that the player would have room to walk there. To add a little variation, I am also slightly randomly scaling each of the plant sprites. Overall, especially since I currently only have 3 distinct sprites being used for plants here, I think it creates a pretty convincing and natural looking landscape. But as I mentioned, I want the player to sort of be naturally coerced into following these natural trails, not just barging their way through the bush. So I needed to set up some collisions. I'm not actually using FaZe's physics engine for this. I've set up my own custom collision detection, which is actually quite straightforward and requires no configuration on my part. I already have a system set up that detects nearby objects, and the player is only ever going to collide with an object that is nearby. So I can get all of the collidable items that are near the player and manually check each of those to see if the player would intersect them if they were allowed to move in a particular direction. Just because 2 sprites overlap, it doesn't mean that they should collide though. For example, right now the player's head overlaps the tree, but the player is just walking in front of the tree, so it shouldn't cause a collision. I modified the collision areas, which is calculated automatically, so that only the area near the player's feet and the area near the base of the plants would cause a collision. This creates convincing looking collisions and also creates the general feeling I want for traversing the terrain. If you want, you generally can kind of wiggle your way through the bushes if you want, but the denser the bush is, the harder that is to do, and generally it is just going to be easier to follow the natural trails. And finally, I've made some changes to the fire mechanic. Notably, items will now also emit smoke as they smolder and burn, and I've scaled the fire effect so that flames will be smaller for smaller objects and larger for larger objects. With a more realistic environment in place, one that is entirely flammable and destructible, I was curious to see if a large fire would 1. Actually look realistic, and 2. Still be able to run smoothly. As I've mentioned in the previous devlogs, there is quite a lot going on to simulate the fire spreading mechanic, and then we also have all of the visual effects for the fires that need to be running on screen as well. The end result, I think, is quite good. Although the gum trees and other plants are flammable, it will take some time for them to actually catch on fire. But if they do, things get out of hand pretty quickly. And surprisingly, this all runs pretty smoothly. I spent quite a bit of time tweaking the effects to create something which I think looks good and feels somewhat realistic in terms of how it looks and how quickly the fire spreads. And I still may need to tweak things further, but I think it's turned out surprisingly well. I think the potential of a disastrous bushfire will help add a feeling of gravity and importance to managing your fires well. I'll just need to make sure it's appropriately punishing so it doesn't just become an easy way to clear out a camping spot. For the next batch of work, I'm hoping to get another core part of the game implemented, which will require adding a beach and coastline. Primarily, this game will involve walking from town to town following the coast, and a large part of the survival mechanics will be based around the beach and ocean. Another important mechanic will be being able to interact with different objects with different tools, harvesting trees for bark or water for example, harvesting the spike from a xantheria, using a knife to open oysters, and so on. I'll see how much of that I can get done before the next devlog, probably just one or the other, but I hope you'll consider sticking around and hitting the subscribe button before you go. Thanks for watching, and I hope you have a great day.